Welcome, everyone. We're just waiting for the room to fill up. We will start momentarily. Okay, we'll get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Lucinda O'Hanlon. I'm the Senior Advisor on Policy and Strategy at Sanitation and Water for All. We're going to start with just a bit of housekeeping. Could you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So there is a translation offered into Portuguese and Spanish. You need to click on the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen. We encourage you to use the chat box function. It's to introduce yourself, but also to ask questions and make comments throughout the webinar. When you use the chat box, please make sure that you select everyone so that your comments can be read by all participants. And then just a reminder to please put yourself on mute when you are not speaking. Thank you so much. So, thank you for being here with us today. We're here as the SWA partnership about a month since COP26, since the COP26 conference began, and more than 5 months away from our 2022 Sector Ministers Meeting, scheduled for May 18-19. Sorry, could you just go to the next slide, please, Larissa? Thank you. In 2021, our partnership, and indeed the entire WASH sector, has made great strides in linking up with our counterparts working in climate action. We were deeply engaged throughout the year in diverse initiatives and processes, all of which culminated at the COP meeting in Glasgow last month. We're excited about what we accomplished working together with partners in the first ever Water Pavilion. We feel we forged inroads in enhancing understanding of water, not only as a resource, but as a basic service. Committed to ensuring an inclusive discussion at COP by bringing voices from every region of the world, we're also enthusiastic about the good practices which were showcased. But this work does not and cannot stop at COP. More work is still needed if we are to see a tighter integration of WASH and climate agendas. More work is needed to scale up the good practices that we know exist. So we're here today to offer space for reflection on the outcomes from COP26, reflections on what all that means for our partners' work at national level, and then how it all fits together as we prepare for the Sector Ministers Meeting, as well as the 2023 UN water process, and indeed the next COP in Egypt in 2022. We have a really great combination of speakers lined up. We're going to start with a framing presentation by Mr. Henk Ovink, the Special Water Envoy from the Kingdom of the Netherlands. Then we'll have a panel discussion with Ms. Lisa Rivera, the Country Director, Water for People in Nicaragua, and Mr. Doba Lovemore, the WASH Information and M&E Officer and SWA Government Constituency Focal Point for Zimbabwe. We have questions and answers after the panel, and as I mentioned already, you can put your comments and questions in the chat box at any point during the webinar. We'll be reading them and they'll be sent to me to put to our speakers. We're pleased to count on the support of our expert resource people, Ms. Dani Gaillard-Pichet, Global Coordinator of Water and Climate Processes at GWP, and Mr. Jose Gesti, the Climate Advisor here at SWA. Ms. Leslie Porres from water.org and co-chair of the SWA High-Level Political Dialogue Work Group will provide us with concluding remarks. So, without further ado, I'm pleased to give the floor to Henk Ovink. Henk, over to you. Hank, we can't hear you yet.
But now you can, I hope.
Now we can hear you, yeah. Please.
Very sorry, Lucinda, something happened. Thanks so much. for giving me the floor, Lucinda. Thanks also for opening, and thanks so much SWA for organizing this. Really look forward to the conversation. I want to give you a brief feedback and coming from COP in Glasgow. I was there myself, also in the way forward, as Lucinda already mentioned. It's great to have this conversation, and it's of critical importance indeed in forging our partnerships towards these stepping stones to make sure that we do more than where we are currently. The Sector Ministers Meeting in May 2022 being in the context of SWA, perhaps the next, but we know that before that we will see each other in Senegal, probably at the World Water Forum in April, events in Asia with the Asia Pacific Water Summit. And beyond May, we will be able to meet each other at oceans conferences, leadership panels, high-level political forums, and beyond. These stepping stones are of critical importance because they bring us together. And that is also a little bit what I wanted to share with you coming from COP. Coming from COP, you can look at it in different ways. One, you can look at the divide and the gap we see in the world, because that gap is still there. And on some levels bigger, on others levels less. There's a gap between interests, between sectors, between objectives, even between North and South and East and West and cultures. But we also saw many opportunities to bridge that gap, and many coalitions coming from the COP that are actually trying to not only bridge that gap, but see that bridging being scaled and replicated across. And that is exactly what we try to do in a collective of partners with our Water Pavilion. So this was the first time in the history of a climate conference that we had a Water Pavilion. Now you have to be very careful with that. I said in the beginning that not becomes the place where water people talk with water people about water, but indeed it becomes an inviting place for the world to join forces on water and climate. And therefore, again, thanks for SWA as one of the over 30 partners that made the Water Pavilion possible, including the government of the Netherlands, the government of the UK and Germany, and the government of Tajikistan, to make sure that that place was open, inclusive, but also comprehensive. We talked about everything climate and water, across energy, disaster risk, water and sanitation, of course, health, COVID, the pandemic, the recovery, investments, finance, and beyond. And that was exactly the reason why we organized this. Over 100 events took place in that pavilion. Thousands of people joined at the COP, but also, of course, online, because we had a very well-functioning hybrid environment. And I want to thank the team that made that possible. Next to SWA, I also want to mention SWA. So that was a success. But how do we harness success? By ensuring that we learn the lessons that came from that and finding opportunities to bring that forward. Water, sanitation and health, it's the first line of defense when we think of the pandemic. Well, I learned something from the last 2 years, that we as a global community did not capture that urgency, that attention was got in the context of the pandemic. So learning from the last 2 years and incorporating the lessons for COP, I think we can do better. Capturing that moment and the momentums to come, really to help invest, scale and replicate best practices in the context of water and climate. And we know water and mitigation are critically linked. We saw that coming also from COP, nature-based solutions, sequestering carbons and beyond. And we also know that water and adaptation are linked. And with that coming out of COP26, the fact that we now have a clear pathway towards an adaptation goal in 2 years to be delivered in the Emirates COP, COP28, knowing that in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, we have a stock taking of where we are. And we also know that in 2023, in March in New York, we will have the second ever United Nations Water Conference, the first one since 1977. And the Netherlands is co-host together with Tajikistan. And that was also something coming from COP. We brought that opportunity of this UN context of water in its full comprehensiveness, linking to all SDGs as well as to climate action. So not only SDG 6, but in the relationship with gender, health, with equality, with peace and security, with urbanization, with the environment, and so forth and beyond, to that COP. And Tajikistan and the Netherlands agreed that the way to do this, to organize these conversations, to bring people together, to figure out what the solutions, approaches, and ways forward are, and to find that process to be able to scale and replicate those opportunities is also through such a pavilion, bringing the world together. So Tajikistan and Netherlands had this dream at the COP and said, why don't we bring the pavilion and these conversations and this growing coalition of partners from across the world? We come from the COP, okay, what is next? World Economic Forum, okay, let's go there. World Water Forum in Senegal, okay, let's go there. SWA meeting, let's go there. The oceans, let's go. Asia Pacific Water Summit, let's make sure that this is a traveling pavilion, a traveling conversation, a traveling coalition that is growing. That the ownership of 2023 is not on the Netherlands and the Tajikistan, but on the world. But the way we are able to drive bridging the gap by these partnerships is that we put a spotlight, appoint champions from youth, from women from across the world that really help us drive the action forward that we so much need in the context of water. Because, and I'm a water ambassador, so you have to be careful if you advocate too much for water, but still investing in water trickles down across every sustainable development goal. We know this. We have to make sure that that conviction, that understanding is resonating across every sector, every silo, every organization, every individual across the world, because it helps us build these bridges, helps us forge partnerships, helps us drive coalitions towards impact and action, and helps us scale and replicate those actions for delivering on the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement. That will get us to 2023 together. That will also get us beyond 2023 in delivering on the promises we made in 2015 with the SDGs and the Paris Agreement. So I really look forward to this journey. The Netherlands as Dutch government is really look forward in making sure that these partnerships are made possible, and that together with Tajikistan, we hold hands as a global community to make sure that we deliver on the promise. I look forward to your inspiration in this conversation and seeing you, of course, online, but I definitely hope in all those many events we see for the next month and years to come. Thanks very much, Lucinda. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Hank, for those reflections. I think the emphasis that you've put on these stepping stones that bring us together and the importance of us working in partnership in an inclusive approach to achieve the entire SDG agenda is just so fundamental. I think you've also laid out a roadmap of the different places where we're going to meet over the next couple of years. And as we go into our panel discussion, I just note that all of those meetings are fed and informed by the amazing things happening at the national level. That's where we're getting these good practices. That's where a lot of the learning is happening. And so I'm going to take us into the panel discussion. I'm going to start with Lisa Rivera. Lisa, you've highlighted that water should be addressed in a comprehensive way. And in that sense, you've been part of discussions that SWA has convened that focus on integrating water and sanitation in national adaptation plans, and the one that's being developed in Nicaragua. What's your opinion on the request made at COP26 to ask countries to accelerate the development of their NAPs? And from your perspective, why is it important to have the WASH sector well represented in these plans? And what steps is your organization taking to support this process? Over to you, Lisa.
Muchas gracias. Buenos días.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. For us, it is very important to accelerate those MPAs. It's important and it's very urgent because we don't have time in order to react. It is important to have the wash sector within our plans because they're very vinculated. Water for People, our organization, has already taken specific measures in order to integrate water, sanitation, and health and bind it with climate change. We have carried out research and we've published a paper regarding this relationship, and we've observed very important conclusions. The first one is that we need to strengthen the wash sector because it is very closely related to action, climate action, and we should also reflect on mitigation, because mitigation and water, for example, reducing water and the energy demand need to be considered as well. And regarding adaptation, we have observed two very important results. So then first of all is that we need strong infrastructures for water, sanitation, and health, and they need to be adapted in order to be able to tackle important factors that can be affected by climate change, such as polluted water or very little water due to the lack of water and droughts. And then in the last year, we have also observed how in the northern region of the Caribbean, all the water and sanitation infrastructure were affected for different reasons. And another conclusion that we reached regarding water infrastructure is that we need to base our research on natural resources, and we need to continue analyzing this at a local level because it's important for the local populations and communities, especially in the rural areas. Those communities, those groups of people must also have all the information available in order to be able to help. In Nicaragua, we have tried to adapt to climate change, and we have already defined some strategic methods which we can follow at the national level in order to improve the infrastructure, for example, or the water resources that we have in the country. And now as an organization, what we're going to try to do is to have an impact in order to enable this plan to move forward and to respond to the needs that I've just mentioned, especially regarding infrastructure and water resources. As a specific step that we are going to take, we have been working and we already have established a process in order to integrate a national plan for strengthening capacities together with the water, sanitation and health department in the government. And what we're doing is we're doing this together in order to establish a plan in order to strengthen the capacity building for the next few years, and highlighting the idea of strengthening all those aspects of water, sanitation and health and its relationship with climate change, both at the national level and the local level, especially in rural areas, as I've said. And I would also like to highlight that it is very important to always focus any national strategies in that direction, in the local direction, because at the end of the day, it's the local aspect which can really struggle and fight against the climate change. Thank you very much.
Lisa, thank you so much for those reflections. You've emphasized the importance of capacity building, and it's true, we need to build capacity in order to be able to work across sectors. It was something I was thinking about when Hank was speaking in building bridges. Sometimes it means we need to learn new languages, all right? It means we need to learn different ways of speaking in order to reach audiences who are in other sectors. I also really appreciate what you said about the participation of local communities and the input that individuals in communities bring for the most sustainable solutions that will really work for their communities. Thank you for highlighting that, and congratulations on the work that you're doing. It sounds really amazing. I'm going to turn now to Doba Lovemore from Zimbabwe. Doba, you attended COP26, and we were so pleased to welcome your minister at our event focused on climate financing. And he spoke about how Zimbabwe is pursuing climate financing related to water, sanitation, and hygiene. So to unlock climate financing for WASH, we know it is essential to have water and sanitation well reflected in the NDCs and the NAPs. And the COP26 outcome calls for revision of NDCs and acceleration of the NAP formulation. So do you think there's scope to further build on the mitigation opportunities from the water and sanitation sector in Zimbabwe's NDC? Over to you, Doba.
Greetings to the meeting from Harare, and thank you so much, Lucinda, for inviting us to this August panel. And allow me to start by appraising the meeting that 90% of problems currently triggered by climate change are water related, causing floods, droughts, and also deteriorating water quality. Hence, our presence as Zimbabwe at COP 2016 representing Zimbabwe's WASH sector and under the banner of the Africa Group was therefore not by coincidence, but a well-calculated move which was meant to push WASH onto the epicenter of the climate change discourse around issues of mitigation and also adaptation. From COP26 and on issues related to mitigation, parties to the Paris Agreement actually jointly agreed to work on reducing greenhouse gas emissions over the decade ahead to ensure that average global temperature is kept below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And our own head of state and government actually reaffirmed Zimbabwe's commitment to emissions reduction in line with our recently revised nationally determined contributions. So this development alone actually represents an opportunity for us to further acknowledge the potential in emission reductions from the water, sanitation, and hygiene sector. There are actually quite a number of untapped opportunities, Lucinda, that exist at country level for the WASH sector to contribute towards global greenhouse gas emissions reductions. These opportunities include improving operational efficiencies of water reticulation systems, actually focusing more on reducing water losses and unaccounted water in the distribution network, especially in urban areas, and also improving water use efficiency going down to household level. For Zimbabwe, for example, this will actually help cut by more than half the energy or electricity currently being used to power urban water treatment plants, especially considering that the bulk of our electricity comes from coal, the elephant in the room in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. Another opportunity also exists in the use of actually green or renewable energy for water and sanitation operations wherever possible. In some cases, this might then entail migrating all fossil fuel powered water supply systems to solar or wind. And coming down to Zimbabwe and following the revision of our NDCs, the WASH sector has actually made it a policy that all small to medium-sized public water schemes to be developed in either rural or our urban areas ought to be solar powered, and existing ones which have been powered by fossil fuel have since been migrated and or recommended for migration to solar. And in terms of wastewater, Lucinda, and also issues around excreta disposal, opportunities also exist for countries to shift to cleaner or more efficient sanitation and treatment processes to allow for harnessing of biogas, which can then be conveyed to settlements for household use, replacing electricity. And in the area of solid waste management, which is also another big issue, waste separation to allow for reuse and recycling actually reduce the amount of waste ultimately directed to dump sites and responsible for methane gas generation, which is a danger to the ozone layer. All these are existing mitigation opportunities, which however still remain untapped at scale for impact and results. Then lastly, Lucinda, and a bit off tangent from this, COP27 is penciled for Egypt and is just by the corner. Some people have already started labeling it as an African COP, but by virtue of Egypt being a water country, let us look forward to turning COP27 into a water conference of parties to the United Nations Convention on Climate Change. Thank you.
What a great note to end on, Doba. Can we make the Egypt COP the water COP? I love that idea, and I hope we can make it happen. Thank you for these reflections on the untapped potential of the WASH sector to contribute to mitigation efforts. We're going to return to you, Doba, because there is a question, but if Lisa is still on the line, I know you can't stay with us the entire time. So I just thought I would return to you to see what you think about climate adaptation as an effective way of working together across sectors, and how can we use the opportunity of the forthcoming SWA Sector Ministers Meeting to mobilize political action to address the gaps that still exist?
Hola, gracias por la pregunta.
Thank you very much for that question. Regarding the water, and I think what Hank was saying at the beginning, water affects different other sectors like the economic sector. So we are related to the agricultural sector, to the infrastructure sector. We also related to education and health. So I think that water is related to so many other sectors that we need to focus our strategies regarding climate change, not only in that direction, but we also need to link them to all the other sectors that I just mentioned. So that's an opportunity that we have for water, not only to be a vertical sector, but we need to relate it to all those others that I just mentioned, including climate change, of course. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Indeed, water is a great connector across all of these different sectors towards the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. I'm going to return to you, Doba. We have a question from the chat already, appreciating your intervention and noting the fact that African countries came quite strongly together at COP to request more financing for adaptation. Developed countries seem to have reacted to this and are discussing a new commitment a commitment was made to double climate financing for adaptation. What do you think of all of that? And do you think that WASH has a role in benefiting from that?
Yes, thank you very much, Lucinda, for that follow-up question. And indeed, actually, Africa is at the center stage of the discussions around climate change, because as Africa, we have already started feeling the impacts of climate change. Last year here in Zimbabwe, we suffered a major cyclone that actually killed in excess of 400 people in just one district. And people still have fresh memories around that. We are now getting into a rainfall season where the meteorological department is already anticipated normal to above normal rains. And really, this is trigger animosity at community level. But attending COP, I think it came out very loud and clear that currently accessing climate finances still remains a big challenge. Although the climate finance continues to grow, accessing these funds, especially at country level, Lucinda, still remains a very big issue, especially financing for adaptation. So one issue that came out of one of the discussions was also for countries to consider unleashing resources, consider engaging with the private sector and unlock the value that come from the private sector in terms of climate change financing. So basically, this is one big constituency which has potential to unlock the funding that is required for adaptation. Thank you.
Thank you, Doba. I'd like to pull Danny into the conversation now. Danny, we're talking about COP and high-level meetings, which are important milestones, but we need continued and steadied work if the mitigation opportunities and the adaptation needs are to be widely reflected in climate policy and financing. So based on this, how do you see the preparatory work towards the sector ministers meeting and the next COP? How can we keep building on this momentum? What concrete actions should partners be taking? And after Danny, I actually want to return to Hank because a similar question was put to you about how do we keep up this momentum? How do we continue this work to capitalize on these opportunities? So Danny, over to you.
Thanks very much, Lucinda. It's a great question, and I could go on for hours about this. I actually did my thesis on something related to this. So, what I would like to say is I think we did see collaboration at COP26 within the water international space in a way that we've never seen it before. And so there is a need to continue that momentum, continue to build on that. I see it maybe slightly different than the way that I understood that Hank was putting it. It's like, well, we see a number of events around the world, and we have to go there and be vocal there. I would suggest that we need alignment. That means we need to know what it is that we're actually aiming for very specifically. And then we have to have some conversations about the complementarity of who can do what in which space, who is best adapted to move forward in different processes. Because I don't think it's valuable for necessarily everyone to engage in everything. And I think that we would be, it could be more appropriate to have those, that coordination about how we actually get there together. That depends on creating trust amongst the actors to work together. And that trust can only be established if we have very clear communications and information sharing amongst the actors in this space. That we are very forward in saying, what is important to each of us, and that we can create a common respect for that, and then create a plan so that we can move forward and use each of these events as a stepping stone to get towards that common goal, rather than necessarily everyone just being frenzied in their own world and trying to do lots of things. So I think that would be really important. And what I would also say specifically within the climate space is that it's not about water organizations talking about climate. What we really need to do is to learn the language, and I think you said that before, that climate actors use, because they do use a different vocabulary. They actually talk quite a lot about water, but they talk about it in different terms. They talk about it in terms of loss and damage, for example. And so we need to learn that vocabulary and be able to talk to them on their terms, so that they can actually the parties themselves can actually be vocal within those climate arenas and be champions for water themselves, and show positive examples that they can showcase and say, look, this actually, doing these things actually helped us achieve our climate goals. So I'll leave it there for the moment.
Thanks so much, Danny. Thanks for reminding us that we need to be clear in understanding what does success look like? What are we really pushing for? We're putting all this energy in. We need to be clear as a community on that. And doing that well takes coordination and collaboration. So thank you for emphasizing those points. Thank you also for returning to this issue of how we talk across sectors and how we equip our allies in adjacent sectors to be champions for the issues that we hold so dear. Hank, I said I was going to come back to you to comment on this thread of conversation. You're talking with people all the time in all different sectors. Do you have reflections on how we do equip people, our allies in adjacent sectors, to be our champions, and reflections on how we keep up this momentum so that each of these stepping stones brings us that much closer towards our collective goals?
Thanks, Lucinda, and thanks, Danny. I couldn't agree more. If the burden of the climate and sustainability challenges is on the water world, we're lost. For that, the water world is too fragmented and too small. That is, I think, also resonated from the COP, is that the conversations were not carried by the water sector, but by other sectors. And I think that is why the pavilion, where I was a little bit hesitant in the beginning, organizing your own world in a climate world, often makes you more alone. But it turned out to be a success because we managed as partners in the partnership with others to turn it, you could say, almost inside out. It were energy people that came to the Water Pavilion to talk about energy and found that working on water could help their energy demands, their energy efficiency, and energy sustainability. There are people from finance that came to the Water Pavilion to talk about reinventing finance models of blending finance, but also reducing risk by investing in water, or creating added value beyond economics, but really looking at social, environmental, and cultural values. And I could go on the climate mitigation world, so much always thinking that water was only about adaptation and resiliency. No, understanding that investing in water helps them mitigate climate change, not only the risks that come with climate change impacts. And I could go on. Environment in the context of biodiversity. And this is indeed what I think, is that the conversation that we've been working on for such a long time, bringing that to other sectors, other silos, organizations, formal and informal, governments and private sector, is of critical importance to be able to have a rippling effect, an impact on sustainability. That burden should not be on us, but we own part of the burden to make sure that that conversation is sparked. We own part of the burden that we reach out and invite others. We own part of the burden that we go out and hijack, or at least invite ourselves into urban, energy, biodiversity, climate, security, and so forth conversations. And I think we showed at the COP that we became better at that. We also showed at the COP that the urgency to do so is perhaps even bigger than ever. And we also showed that others are very much looking for those pathways, those opportunities. Then another part, which I totally agree, Danny, a party is something different than action. Having a good crowd together doesn't mean that you have a result and impact. And the need is so massive. And as I said in the beginning, the COVID pandemic, while every week, sometimes every day, a global leader said, wash your hands, was not enough for us to really organize ourselves as a global sector with the health sector to ensure that we were bridging that gap on wash. So even with such a political campaign, you could almost say, with needs and demands from across the world that is still there, we had a hard time really making sure that we use that campaign as a guarantee success factor to drive WASH, replicate our actions, and have a bigger impact. That's a learning, that's a hard learning for us. In the context of climate, we see that same effect. We know, and we say it, 90% of all climate disasters are water related. Then what? That was last year the same, and 5 years ago too. Reversing that is going to be of critical importance. And then I come to your point. That doesn't mean that we need everybody in everything all the time. It means that bridging the gaps by building bridges is you do with coalitions that matter in the context of the challenge you want to face. If it's WASH, climate, disaster risk, security, food security, economics, gender, poverty, migration, conflict, we know that within each and every one of those pathways, there are strong coalitions that help us drive forward. Last, too often that coalition is looked upon as a too narrow coalition. And we need local communities, indigenous, women, children. We need to look beyond the usual suspects in driving that coalition. So I do agree you don't need everybody, but we do need more than we currently bring together. And I think that is what you could say there are 3 pillars. We need this comprehensive approach that looks at the long term and brings sectors together in a very radically inclusive way to ensure that, yes, we reach out to everybody, that inclusivity is not a word, but a verb and a culture and a way of working. And we need it sustainably for the long term, because we find ourselves constantly in a post-disaster context, looking back and working on recovery. We have to turn that around into a proactive, future-oriented way where we build sustainability and resiliency and equity for all. And I think that change is going to be of critical importance. Last, the investments going out until today are increasing climate change and making us more vulnerable. The 1% of those investments is where we find inspiration, where aspiration is across the board. That is the one we can scale up. And I think, and I said it as COP, we only need 4 steps. From 1 to 2 to 2 to 4, 4 to 16, and we have a majority of investment. And I think that is on our, that is what the stakes are high. That is what we have to do. And this is how we can use pathways forward, stepping stones to make sure that when we land in 2023, we have a grip on that agenda, a grip on these coalitions, a grip on the investments, and that we are ready to commit ourselves to really drive implementation, replication, and scale. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hank, for these comments about reaching out, being proactive in how we reach out, and then how we leverage our partnerships in order to achieve the maximum result. I think the observation you make about COVID and it not the hard reality, right, of so much attention to hand washing, and yet not much has changed. I think it's an important point that we need to think more about. How do we translate those sorts of moments into really concrete political will to prioritize water and sanitation and hygiene at the national level? There's a conversation happening in the chat about how you genuinely get different stakeholders involved at the national level, because we're sitting in different ministries. Those ministries don't always talk to each other. How do they come together? And this is part of the work that SWA has been trying to support over this past year, of linking up ministers responsible for water and ministers responsible for climate through our mutual accountability mechanism process. We provide a platform for multi-stakeholder conversations, multi-stakeholder meaning different governments, civil society, private sector, and so on, but also across sectors. I'd like to, it's an open question to the panel. Maybe you could use the raising your hand function. How do you see this working at the national level? How can we support more of this linking up and bring good examples to the sector ministers meeting and beyond? Anybody want to take on that topic? I see Jose raising his hand. Like physically, not with the...
Sí, muchas gracias, Lucinda.
Thank you, Lucinda.
Hablaré en castellano.
I will speak in Spanish.
Pero lo que pasa es que me estoy oyendo a mí mismo también. No sé si...
I can hear myself for some reason.
So that's a little complicated. Shall I... I have to click on Spanish. ¿Está mejor ahora? Sí.
I think now it's working. Okay. Okay, good. Thank you, Lucinda, for your question. And I think that what we are saying is really important. We are talking about big events where we see high-level representatives from different countries, and then what we see really out there, and I work hands-on. I have worked in Jordan, and I have seen that division firsthand, how at the level of the countries we can work in bringing together different sectors, very different sectors sometimes, and how to build those bridges. This is what we're talking about. What we are doing from SWA is to facilitate discussions at the country level, where we make a lot of emphasis, we put a lot of emphasis on bringing different parts to the same virtual room, so as to have a joint conversation. And that way we can start building those bridges in a practical manner, just as we are talking now. You may be surprised to know how we were able, through these discussions with different stakeholders, as Lucinda said, from the government, from the academia, from the WASH sector, but also stakeholders who have been working on fighting against climate change, stakeholders who fight to reduce risks and disasters, people who are more familiarized with climate-related issues, because it is these stakeholders that we need to bring together in order to break the ice, so to speak. So what we do is, knowing that very often the stakeholders that work at the country level with climate planning obviously need to work in different sectors, and they must work with mitigation and adaptation in climate change in many sectors, as it has been mentioned today: energy, transport, but also water, obviously. And what we need to take into account is that stakeholders working in climate planning cannot be expert in the whole range of sectors that they need to tackle. And since they cannot be experts in everything, it is good for them to hear from our sector, from the WASH sector, so as to get familiar about how we see the opportunities that we can see, opportunities to reduce greenhouse gases, what the needs of the sectors are to adapt to climate change. Again, you may be surprised, but many times what we do in this type of discussions with different stakeholders, we bring pictures where we share and we talk about the areas of the country where there is a lack of WASH systems, and also areas that are risking flooding. And this is very visual for people who work with climate planning, and something which is also very visual for them is to try to understand the risk of drought with and how it links with the lack of drinking water. So once we give them those images, the people working around climate planning start to understand what our needs are. So we're trying to spark that conversation. And it also happens very often during these country meetings that the stakeholders who work and who are familiarized with WASH, we are not so familiar with what the Paris Agreement means, or what a nationally determined contribution is all about, or what a national adaptation plan is about. So as Hank said, sometimes people are responding to emergencies. We see this in Latin America when they have to have a response for a hurricane, or sometimes we see that we are not always familiarized with these processes. So trying to, it's all about trying to reach some common ground, to work together and to discuss these questions together, so we understand the vocabulary of adaptation and mitigation, so that stakeholders can understand what our needs are. And you may be surprised to see how we create these discussion fora and how this brings about new opportunities, such as the ones we've seen in Nicaragua. Lisa talked about it. They're creating a working group to do a risk analysis for the wash sector, to try and understand better what the impacts are on our sector, and at the same time we can convey to the adaptation expert what our issues are. So these are all processes which are being activated. It's easy to activate them. The good news is that in our sector we do have the tools and resources available when it comes to doing, for example, national adaptation plans. The wash sector has the tools necessary to be an essential part. I'm about to finish now, Lucinda, don't worry. We want to be a part that contributes effectively to these national adaptation plans. Thank you.
Jose, thank you so much for those reflections, and sorry to rush you. I just noticing the time, but we don't have that much time left, but there is an important question that I want to go back to Doba with about the role of CSOs. What can CSOs in the water sector do to be more effective in discussions with government agencies in the climate sector? Now, Doba, I know you don't sit in the climate sector, but you are sitting in the government. Could you offer some reflections, please, on the role of CSOs there?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Lucinda. Actually, one thing that you would realize with CSOs is that within that constituency, there is a wealth of technical expertise around WASH and also around climate change. And beyond technical expertise, there is also the issue of resources. Remember the 100 billion target. CSOs have capacity to mobilize the much needed resources for communities to be able to adapt to climate change. But for this to make logical sense, especially at community level, there is need for government leadership. Government needs to come in and set up systems that allow for interaction between civil society and government, and beyond that, also other constituencies, including the research and learning institutions, the private sector, like I indicated, and also the utilities. So basically, for CSOs to be able to deliver on their mandate and deliver effectively, there is need for government to play its lead role in terms of making sure that there is an enabling environment for that to happen. Yeah. Thank you, Lucinda.
Thank you so much, Doba, for that reflection. I think a consistent theme that is coming out in this conversation is the importance of partnership, of multi-stakeholder partnership for moving our common agenda forward. So I want to link back to what this means for the preparatory process towards the 2022 SMM. I think that there are some really concrete opportunities in the prep process for discussions to be happening at country level, taking account the particularities of each national context, identifying specific actions and targets that are important in your multi-stakeholder environment. And then the SMM presents this opportunity to elevate that to top decision makers, to get that political attention to those actions. Jose, I can give you the floor for like 1 minute to identify a couple other of the opportunities we see in the prep process, if you want to take us through some of those, okay?
Sí, muchas gracias.
Yes, thank you, Lucinda. Looking at the results of the discussions during COP26, I can see very tangible things that I deem that can be opportunities that are interesting in order to continue to work and follow on the path that we've started. In the COP26, we urged countries to draft the national adaptation plans, as we have been discussing. This is important for Latin America, where there are very few countries that have already done so, although we do have 3 available already in Spanish, and which may be translated. This is a very important opportunity for the sector to be present by using the tools that we have available, being present at the consultations. In terms of mitigation, COP26 urged countries to not wait for 5 more years, but really to start looking at what their priorities are from next year, because we still haven't reached the objectives that we set out with regard to greenhouse effect gases, for instance. This is a very important opportunity for the water sector. As Dova said earlier, opportunities must be included as national priorities. And finally, I can see it's a very good opportunity, the fact of developed countries to have committed to double their financing for adaptation. I think that before the high-level meeting in May, we need to build more alliances based on these three key elements in order to continue to integrate water and sanitation in the climate policy and in financing issues.
Really clear, Jose. Thank you. And absolutely, those are entry points that SWA intends to pursue with the entire partnership. The preparatory process, I just really want to emphasize this, that the value of a high-level meeting, a sector ministers meeting, is only as valuable as the preparatory process. And so I just want to encourage the partners on the call to engage actively in the preparatory process, because it's your work at the national level which is going to make this meeting interesting, which is going to make it worthwhile, which is going to produce the actions that we want our ministers to take and lay the foundations, I hope, for what they then could do at COP27 and beyond to 2023 and many of the other events that have been mentioned on this call. So I will stop there and hand it to our co-chair of the High-Level Political Dialogue Work Group, Leslie Porres. Thank you so much for being with us today, Leslie. You have the unenviable task of synthesizing and pulling together this very rich discussion. Please, Leslie, over to you.
Oh, well, thank you for that, Lucinda. I'm not really sure I'm up for the task, but I will do my best to offer some closing reflections based on our experience with COP and preparations that are already underway for May, as well as so many of the reflections that have been shared here. So we'll see. But I think to start from the beginning, and some of the points that have resonated with me quite strongly is we've seen a lot of momentum, right? And this was referred to by Hank in his opening statements. It was emphasized as well by Donnie. There's really a way in which the water sector has come together. The WASH people and the WRN people, we really came together for this Water and Climate Pavilion in a way that we haven't before. And I think all of you here who are firmly embedded in the WASH sector understand that this is new for us in terms of really trying to understand and grasp climate. And I actually think there's a really interesting parallel that I've identified in terms of what happened at COP and what we're trying to plan for at the sector ministers meeting, right? The event itself, as Lucinda was just saying, is not nearly as it's important, but it's not quite as important as all of the preparatory work that we put in the buildup, right? People don't just come to COP and make brand new pronouncements about what they're going to do in regards to climate mitigation or adaptation or resilience, right? And so that's the same here. It's the preparatory work that we start doing now to really have an important dialogue that hopefully is helping us to achieve goals that we've identified. Now, going back to an earlier question in the chat, how do CSOs be more effective in really talking with government agencies about climate? I mean, if we knew that, we'd be doing it already, right? We're learning. This is very much a learning process and we're in it together. We're in it as a WASH community. We're in it as a community that's really looking to partner with our peers in the larger water sector, as well as some of these other ministries, understanding more deeply who's involved with climate and really embracing this together. And I do want to call for us, there's this competition sometimes between the urgency. Climate change is very real. I think we're all ever more acutely aware of the impacts that it's having on our own daily lives, on the impacts of the places where we work. But at the same time, we have to make sure that we're taking the time to really understand everything and understanding how we can move forward together most efficiently for the greatest impact. And so, as other speakers have alluded to already, the Sector Ministers Meeting is the next big event for SWA, but I know Hank was also reminding us there's definitely the World Water Forum in Senegal coming up. And then the Sector Ministers Meeting itself is positioning us for the UN Water Conference in 2023 in New York. And then there are other conversations that maybe aren't as specific to water where we should, as Donnie was saying, in an organized way, make sure our voice, our coordinated voice is heard, even if it's not each individual organization. And to me, that's one of the great things that SWA can serve as, right? It's this meeting place and point where all of us from the water and sanitation community can actually come together and align on these messages, you know, and really, really amplify the voice more than any one individual organization, be it my own or any of the others on this call can do. And so that's one of the really great things. We have a mission. We know that there's a lot that we don't know, but we also have this really strong coordinating body and mechanism within SWA to help us move forward and get there. So, of course, and that, you know, that's what we can do as a community. And there, as Lucinda was just emphasizing, there is the really critical, important work happening at the national level in deep collaboration with governments, as Mr. Doba was emphasizing, as well as Lisa. So there's so much there and opportunity, and it's really about us coming together and keeping the momentum thoughtfully, efficiently as we move forward. And with that, I'm actually going to turn it back to Lucinda for the proper closing. But thank you all for being on this journey with us.
Thank you so much, Leslie. I think we're finishing with collaboration, partnership, working together towards our shared objectives. SWA is here to support. Please reach out if you would like more information about the preparatory process to the Sector Ministers Meeting. I believe there's a slide coming up with the email address that you can write to. We're really looking forward to working with all of you to harness this momentum in order to achieve really concrete impacts. So as Leslie just said, thank you for being on this journey with us. We'll stay in touch. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.